There is a story in the Old Testament that, if I'm honest with you, I consider the most disturbing in the entire Bible. It could very well be deemed inappropriate for minors. So, before you continue, I want to ensure you know that this story might not be suitable for all ages and could trigger some past trauma. The story I am referring to is found in chapters 19 to 21 of the Book of Judges. Many people know chapter 19, but don't read the rest of the story. I believe there are several important lessons you and I need to learn from such a disturbing tale. First, I will tell the story as dramatically as possible and then explore the lessons I think we can learn. Join me in Judges chapter 19. In chapter 19, verse 1, in the days when there was no king in Israel, a Levite living in a remote part of the country in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. I want you to understand that here is a Levite man living in the northern part of Israel, and he takes this woman to be his concubine or wife, whichever you want to call it, and she is living in the south, in Bethlehem. Let's continue the story. She was unfaithful to him and left him for her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah, where she stayed for 4 months. She betrayed him and returned to her father's house in Bethlehem. So the story continues. Essentially, this Levite man wants to get his wife back, so he travels from the northern hill country of Ephraim to the south in Bethlehem to seek this woman and be with her again. He arrives there, and her father is very hospitable. Several times the man says, "Hey, I have to leave, give me my wife so I can go back home." And the father says, No, stay another night." He says, "Okay, I'll stay another night." And this repeats for several days, until finally the man says, "Hey, with all due respect, I appreciate your hospitality, but I need to leave. I need to go back home." So he finally sets off back home, and that's where all the tragedy occurs. Well, the man is with his concubine traveling from Bethlehem in southern Israel to the north, in Ephraim. They were near Jebus, and the day was about to end. The man says, "Why don't we stop in this city of Jebus and spend the night here?" But his master answered, "We will not stop in a foreign city where there are no Israelites. We will continue to Gibeah." So his servant said, "Let's try to reach one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah." So they continued their journey, and the sun set as they approached Gibeah in Benjamin. They went there, and to their surprise, no one was willing to take them into their homes. Hospitality was a huge thing in Israelite culture. At the end of the night, an old man appears in the square and says, "Why are you still here? Has anyone already taken you into their home?" And they respond, No one has taken us in." And the old man says, "You know what? You can stay with me tonight." And the Levite responds, "Great. I just want to warn you that we don't need anything from you. We have enough food for our donkeys, for me and my concubine. We just need a place to rest our heads. If you give me a pillow, that's all I need." And the old man says, "No problem. You can stay with me." So this Levite man, his servant, and his concubine spend the night in this man's house in Gibeah. And then this happens. While they were enjoying themselves, suddenly wicked men from the city surrounded the house and pounded on the door. They said to the owner of the house, the old man, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." Wow, man, this is where the story takes a turn. There are perverted men living in Gibeah, Benjaminites, who go to the house of this old man and say, "Hey, we know you have a guest in your house. Bring him out so we can all have sex with him." Now watch what happens next. The owner of the house went out and said, "Please don't do this wicked thing, my brothers. After all, this man came to my house. Don't commit this horrible atrocity here. Let me bring out my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Abuse them and do what you want with them, but don't commit this outrageous thing against this man. We will deal with this a bit later." But what happens next is unthinkable. It says in verse 25 that the men would not listen. So he took his concubine and sent her outside to them. They raped and abused her throughout the night until dawn. At daybreak, they let her go. Now, my friend, this is why I said that this story might be considered inappropriate for minors and could trigger some things from your past. Because I want you to imagine, here is a group of perverted men taking turns having sex with this woman. They are raping her all night long until in the morning they finally let her go. And this is what happens with this young woman. Tragically, at the break of dawn, the woman returns, and as daylight breaks, she collapses at the door of the house where her master was. You can imagine she is so worn out, so beaten, so abused throughout the night by these men that she barely has the strength to crawl back to the house of this man and just collapses on the porch and lies down. Now see what happens next. It says here that when her master got up in the morning, opened the doors of the house, and went out to continue his journey, there was the woman, his concubine, collapsed near the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he told her, "let's go." But there was no answer. The woman had been so abused that she had died. Notice that it says here that the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. Now what happens next is very sad and horrible, but it goes like this. When he reached his house, he took a knife, held his concubine, cut her into 12 pieces limb by limb, and then sent her throughout the territory of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, "Nothing like this has ever happened or been seen since the day the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt until now." Think about it, discuss it, and speak up. This man took his concubine to his house, cut her into 12 pieces, and undoubtedly attached a letter to each piece of his deceased concubine, and sent a different piece of her body to the 12 tribes of Israel, with a letter detailing exactly what had been done by their own brothers, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. And when these other tribes saw and read what had happened to this woman, they said, "Nothing like this has ever happened in our history." Now there is much more to the story in chapters 20 and 21, so I want you to hold on, but this is where I want to start looking at some lessons we can learn from this. The first lesson is this: when there is no accountability in our lives, we tend to strongly stray. Observe Judges chapter 19, verse 1, which we read earlier, but I'll read it again. "In those days, there was no king in Israel. You and I, when we don't have to be accountable, when there is no fear of having to explain ourselves or be accountable for our decisions and actions, we are more prone to make poor decisions because we think we can make these decisions in isolation without having to answer to anyone else. And that's exactly what was happening in Israel. There was no king, there was a law, but people were not respecting the law. It was not being enforced, and as a result, they ended up doing something they probably never imagined they would do. The second mini lesson I want to address is ensuring we treat every human being as a bearer of God's image. Here is this man saying, "It would be wrong for you to do what you want with this man, but you can do what you want with my daughter and his concubine." His mindset was that the life and virtue of this man were worth more than his own daughter and this man's concubine. We need to ensure, and that's why viewing inappropriate sites and things like that, we must ensure we don't do it. If you want to stop watching things online that you know you shouldn't be watching, and you know what I mean, I want you to see every girl you're looking at as a bearer of God's image, as someone who is your daughter. Imagine if you wanted someone to look at your daughter doing the things you're watching on the screen. But here is the third thing I want to highlight in this story. The further you and I drift from God, the more vulnerable we become to doing things we never imagined we would do. You see, when you look at the book of Judges as a whole, what you will see is a nation of people who have slowly drifted away from God. They have slowly strayed. And what you see happening in chapters 19 to 21 is the culmination of moving away from God. and it shows how far the nation as a whole had strayed from God. And my friend, you and I are no different, because if we don't maintain a close connection with God, if we drift away from God, if we stray from God, that's when we, like the Israelites, will find ourselves doing things that someone 10 years ago would have tried to tell us we would do, and we would be convinced there is no way we would do those things. There's no way I would get divorced, no way I would have an affair, no way I would get fired from my job because I was caught watching something online, no way I would be smoking marijuana or whatever. The further you drift from God, the more vulnerable you become to committing that sin. Now, the story doesn't end in chapter 19. I wish it did, but it actually gets worse, because what happens now in chapter 20 is a civil war between the 11 tribes of Israel, and they are fighting against the tribe of Benjamin, because it is the tribe of Benjamin that committed that atrocious act of sin against one of their own Israelite brothers. So I encourage you to read in detail chapters 20 and 21. But to summarize, there is a massive battle. Thousands and thousands of lives are lost as a result of that battle on both sides. And what ends up happening is that only 600 Benjamite men are left. Then in chapter 21, the other 11 tribes begin to feel sorry or feel pity for the tribe of Benjamin, because they are basically worried that this tribe of Benjamin is going to become extinct, since only 600 men are left alive. But there are no Benjamite women for them to marry and reproduce. Now they have another problem, because now they are worried that one of their 12 tribes of Israel is going to become extinct. This leads to my fourth lesson. Every bad decision we make has consequences we cannot choose. Although what these Benjamite people did was wrong, the other 11 tribes coming and actually fighting and killing them was a decision they made. And now they have to deal with the outcome of that decision, and the Benjamites also have to pay for the outcome of their bad decision. Listen, you can choose your sin, but you cannot choose your consequences. Every decision you make has consequences, and the problem is, personally, you and I cannot choose those consequences. So what happens is that these Israelites go and kill men from this clan called Jabesh Gilead, and there are 400 women who have never been with a man. So they take these 400 women and give them to 400 of the 600 Benjamite men, so these Benjamite men can reproduce. But what's the problem? Simple math. There were 600 Benjamite men who couldn't find wives because all the wives had been killed and dead, and 400 of them now have a wife given to them from the clan of Jabesh Gilead. So the problem is now there are 200 Benjamite men who don't have wives. And that's why I said one bad decision often leads to another, because what happens next is these Israelites basically say, you know what? We all made a vow and said we couldn't give our daughters to any of the Benjamites, but it doesn't say anything about if they are taken. So what happens is they have to make another bad decision and say, you know what? This is what the Benjamites need to do. They send a message and say, look, there is a festival coming up, a feast, and basically some of our daughters are going to be dancing and having fun at that feast. Technically, we can't give our daughters to you because we made a vow. But if you find them and kidnap them, that's your problem. If you find them and kidnap them, we will be free from that vow, because technically we did not give our daughters to you. And you will be able to have a wife and procreate. So they have this feast, and essentially these 200 Benjamite men go and snatch and kidnap these women while they are dancing at a feast and take them back as their wives. Now personally, I know this is a crazy story and I tried to summarize it as quickly as I could, but the point is this: one bad decision often leads to another, and all kinds of bad decisions affect other people. Go through this story again and see how many people were negatively affected by one bad decision. Some of the Benjamite men deserved what happened to them, but most of the people in Benjamin had nothing to do with it and died in battle. The people of Jabesh Gilead died too. The women were then taken from their land and given to these Benjamites, and then these other women were kidnapped by the Benjamite men and taken away from their families. All this happened because of bad decisions, but here is the fifth and final lesson I want to encourage you with today. God has grace for us, even in the midst of our most destructive decisions. Notice how the book of Judges ends. It says here that the Benjamites did this and took the number of women they needed from the dancers they had captured. They returned to their own inheritance, rebuilt their cities, and lived in them. At that time, each of the Israelites returned from there to their own tribe and family. Each returned from there to their own inheritance. And of course, the last verse of the book of Judges characterizes and describes the whole book of Judges. It says here that in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. My friend, although God was merciful in allowing this tribe of Benjamin to rebuild and repopulate and not be extinct, there were consequences for their decisions. And if there's nothing else you take away from this story, I want to encourage you to understand that every decision you and I make has consequences. Many times they can't even be measured, and consequences we can't choose. See you next time. Goodbye for now. God bless you.